Okay, so before Rav Kevin teaches us halacha, and before we go to the Gemara, a friend of mine, Arya Yosef ben Esther Chaya, is going in for an operation on Monday, Ari Ginsberg, and hoping the merit of the shir that he makes a full refuah, because it's always risky to go for an operation, even something that's smooth sailing. And we know it's in the merit of the learning and the davening, etc., that please God, he makes a full recovery. The operation is a success. And I wish you, Ari Ginsberg, a lot of good health, my friend. And he's the gabbai at Rabbi Zev Glass's shul, as well as my next door neighbor. And he's got the most amazing voice. You know, some people, like, they built with for chazonos. They pay me to stop davening. So, but some people are good at it. All right. So let's get started, Kev.
Okay, let's continue with the about the theme of the Shemitah year. Okay, so produce grown in the Arava area in Israel, which is south of Beersheba, has no Kedushat Shvit. Produce imported from outside Israel has no Kedushat Shvit and may be eaten. So Kedushat Shvit, Kedushat Shvit means the sanctity of the seventh year. So that's why you can eat it. That's why in South Africa, as long as you know that the fruit you're eating is locally grown, there's no problem. The Shemitah doesn't apply. And it says, Heta Mechira, this is an important thing. Heta Mechira refers to produce grown on Jewish land which is leased to a non-Jew for the duration of the seventh year and worked according to specific rabbinic guidelines. A practice approved by Rav Elchanan Spector in the Shemitah year of 1889, renewed by Israel's first chief rabbi Rav Kook in 1910, and continued by all subsequent chief rabbis in Shemitah years that followed. Produce from the Heta Mechira has no Kedushat Shvit and may be discarded as usual. Truma and Maisa are taken without a brocha, however. Note, most cafes and restaurants utilize the Heta Mechira for produce served on the premises. In all the above cases, including the ones I mentioned over the last few days, one must be sure that a current reliable certifying Tu'udah certificate has been issued. Okay, one more point before we conclude. How long is the Shemitah prohibition in effect? And the answer is, one must be careful to buy only approved fruit products until the spring of the 8th year. Fruit purchased after that time has no suspicion of Kedushat Shvit. Frozen vegetables should have a certifying hechsher for a year after Shemitah. Canned foods have dates printed on them, but it is best to buy only those products with the hechsher non-Shemitah product. And to note, Oitzer Beit Din wine may remain in the market for years and one should check it. Okay. To be continued, as they say.
Good. All right. So we're going to start the Gemara Shir with a few quick minute review for what we discussed prior the other day, just to put you guys in the mindset. So if you remember, the Mishnah stated if the animal fell forward, etc., because of the person's digging, in other words, it startled the animal, the owner of the pit is liable. If it fell backward because of the sound of the digging, he is exempt. So the Gemara, as you know, focused on the meaning of the word forward and backward. So Rav said, forward means literally that the animal fell on its face, it fell frontwards. And backwards meant literally that it fell on its back. And both this ruling and that ruling refer to a case where the animal fell into a pit. So the other criteria is an animal actually has to fall into the hazard itself, the stationary hazard. So the Mishnah teaches that one who digs a pit in the public domain is liable only if the animal falls in head first, because that's exactly what the pasuk implies. And it dies because of its foul air, but not if it falls backwards and dies because of the impact. So we said, well, how does this seem to relate? So it says, like, look, Rav follows his own reasoning. We've got the explanation of Rav and Shmuel, because Rav said, concerning a pit in the public domain, for which the Torah made the digger liable, it made him liable because of the pit's foul air, which he brought into being, and not because of the impact of the fall in it. Okay, so obviously, if the animal fell forward, you're liable for the simple reason is that the animal, as it's falling on its way down, sucks up the foul air, and therefore that kills it. But Rav doesn't hold that you're liable as far as impact in the public domain is concerned. And therefore, if the animal fell on its back, for that reason, he would state that you would be exempt. So obviously, there's a variant interpretation of the Mishnah. And what's that opinion? Shmuel. Because Shmuel says, Shmuel says, if the animal fell into the pit, doesn't matter if he falls forward on its face or backwards on its rear, the owner of the pit is liable to pay for the damage. And we explained last time quite clearly that Shmuel follows his own reasoning, because Shmuel said concerning a pit in the public domain, the Torah made the digger liable because of the pit's foul air, and certainly also because of the impact of the fall within it. So what he's basically saying there, as we learned, is that in the public domain, Rav has always said that you don't own the ground. The ground is not yours. You're digging it up so that foul air and the toxicity of the soil that you release and various sort of elemental attributes and microscopic debris that can go into your lungs or open wounds, etc., that exacerbates the death of an animal. And for that, you're liable. But it's not your ground, so therefore you're not liable in the public domain. Shmuel said it doesn't matter because you actually created the hazard. So whether or not you dug the pit and it's the foul air that kills the animal, or by digging up the pit, you've actually created something deep enough as an excavation where the animal dies as a result or gets damaged, you're liable even from the impact of the fall. So we understood it's a bit easier to understand Shmuel. Rav's got his genius reasoning, but I don't have privy to it, is that if I picked up a stone in a public domain, and not me, let's say you have a Ruvain that picked up a stone in the public domain and hit Shimon in the head and killed him. He would be liable, if he was aiming for him, he'd be liable for execution. Why? Because it doesn't matter for him to claim that the stone belonged to the recreational park. His actions lifted that stone, threw it, cracked the guy's head open, and when the guy's bleeding and dead on the ground, he can't say, well, it wasn't my stone, it's the public stone, therefore I'm not liable, because they're liable to kill him. So it's easier to understand Shmuel, who said that both the impact of the fall, which you caused by your actions, by digging a pit, a hazard in the public domain, which causes that sort of liability for injury or death, or alternatively, the foul air that you dug up through your actions has made you liable. Whereas Rav would turn around and say that basically, you're not liable for the impact of the fall because it's not your ground, it's public ground. And you're only responsible for the foul air that you've dug up to have caused that level of toxicity. Okay, so therefore, if you fall backwards, we can understand how Rav concludes according to the Mishnah. Why? Because the Mishnah was saying that basically, I'm just going to share my screen a second, just as a summary, and then we're going to get to the next point, but it's going to make a lot of sense, is that, if I can just show you, gentlemen, is that if we have a look at the screen share, the only problem with Zoom is I had to get the screen right. Okay. All right. So if you have a look, it says here, the Mishnah turns to a case when an animal was caused to fall into a pit by an external factor. If an animal fell forward because of the sound of the person's digging, obviously the animal was startled, the owner of the pit is liable. If it fell backward because of the sound of the digging, the owner of the pit is exempt. So obviously it's not the sound of the digging alone, but it seems to be that the the major factor for liability or exemption is whether it fell forward or backward. So if it fell forward, according to Rav, it breathed in the toxicity of the foul air, and therefore that killed the animal, you're liable. If it fell on its back, you're not liable for the impact of the fall, and therefore Rav we'd understand this explanation of the Mishnah according to Rav. According to Shmuel, we battle a little bit. Why would we battle? Because Shmuel said, doesn't matter if the foul air or the impact kills the animal or injures the animal. At the end of the day, you created the hazard. But then it says here in the Mishnah, if it fell backward because of the sound of the digging, he is exempt. So we've got to have an explanation as to how Shmuel would discuss or agree with the Mishnah in terms of exemption for falling on his back. Because again, there's impact death. So how would Shmuel explain this particular Mishnah, and it still coincides with his particular opinion? Well, if you have a look, the Shmuel has to interpret the Mishnah as follows. What's the case to which the Mishnah refers to say that if the animal falls backwards because of the sound of the digging, the owner of the pit is exempt? It's a case where the animal stumbled in the pit and upon losing its footing, fell backward of the pit, striking the ground outside of the pit. Okay, so let me just explain to you what we're talking about here. We're talking about a case here where, well, Shmuel generally would say if you fell into the pit and the animal died by the impact, by hitting its head, even backwards, it doesn't matter. It fell backwards, broke its back, broke its head open, and in that particular case, the animal is dead. You're liable. How would he answer this Mishnah that says you're not liable for falling backward? He said, well, in the case where the animal kind of stumbled across the excavation and there were loose stones or whatever, the animal's legs caved in, and when it took a land, it landed with its head outside of the pit and therefore cracked its head open. So one of the criteria to make a person liable for damage in a pit is to fall inside the pit. And according to this particular explanation, I want to discuss with you a tolda of a pit, which, if you remember, one says if somebody leaves their stone, their burden, or their knife in the public domain, you are liable, which is a tolda of pit. The pit, the actual of the pit, is an excavation, but a tolda is any stationary hazard that can cause damage. So technically, the problem is if you fall and slip on the object and hit your head on the public ground, there's a problem in terms of liability. It seems definitely according to Rav, but even according to Shmuel, you have to kind of slip on the object and crack your pip on the exact hazard that you slipped on. Difficult to understand. They're obviously right. I've got to understand why that is, because there's a problem. If you slip on something somebody left in the public domain, according, there was an explanation according to Rav, and you consider it your object and you haven't renounced ownership, it's considered shore, at which case you're liable because it's as though a bull or something under your property created damage. It's not something within the public domain. And if you have released ownership of it, in other words, if it's something that you've discarded, it then would fall into the category of a bull. But either way, unless you slip on the object and you slip on the ownerless ground, there's no liability. So I don't quite understand that. I don't understand how you can leave something in the public domain, have somebody fall in it, they suffer an injury or death, and a person's off the hook. So please God, we're going to go through some of the duffs and try and find some explanation for that. But so far we've learned that Shmuel agrees with the Mishnah that even if the animal fell backwards, if it fell and had the impact technically outside the pit where it had, then in that case there would be an exemption of payment. All right, so that's the summary of what we've done so far. And now we're going to have a refutation on Rav. I hope, guys, I've given a reasonable explanation in terms of a summary.
Very good.
Okay. Pleasure. All right, so now we're dealing with the new part. There's a challenge to Rav. They challenge Rav on the basis of the following brisa. If the animal falls into the pit, then whether it fell forward or backwards, the owner of the pit is liable to pay for the damage. This is a refutation on Rav. So I was going to ask you guys on what basis is there refutation on Rav? Firstly, in order to know why this refutes Rav, you would have to know how Rav holds. Does that make sense, guys?
Yeah.
All right. So I think what I'm going to do in this particular case is actually share my screen so that you guys can be aware. Is Arthur still with us? I feel like this is a seance. Calling Arthur. Calling Arthur.
Yeah, you're very good at this, Damon, eh?
Do you remember there was that episode of Mork and Mindy? And it was Mork calling Orc.
Awesome.
Mork calling Orc.
Awesome.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome, I think. Yeah.
Are you sure it wasn't Mork calling Orc? It was Awesome.
No. Mork was from Orc. Awesome was the
guy he would contact from his planet. So he'd sit in his egg and contact him with mental telepathy. Anyway, I'm going to just share my screen. Now, let's examine this. A challenge to Rav is cited. They challenge Rav on the basis of the following brisa. If the animal falls into the pit, then whether it falls forwards or backwards, the owner of the pit is liable to pay for the damage. This is a refutation on Rav. Apart from which, this contradicts what, guys?
Other opinion says only if you fall forward.
Correct. And where's that opinion from? Excellent, Kevin.
Is that Rav Natsan?
Well, it's the Mishnah. It's our actual Mishnah itself.
Okay.
It's our actual Mishnah itself. So, which states, if I can just share my screen and you guys give me a second.
Nice, Kevin.
Okay, that's shot.
I'm not in your league though, Gavin.
Because I play in 15th league. You play in that.
No, never. You're too modest. You're too sunra.
Okay, so the Mishnah turns. Okay, guys, listen. So the Mishnah turns to a case when the animal was caused to fall into a pit by an external factor. If the animal fell forward because of the sound of the person's digging, the owner of the pit is liable. If it fell backwards because of the sound of the digging, he is exempt. So the Mishnah is saying there's liability for if the animal falls forward but not backwards. But however, we learned something different in a brisa. What did we learn in a brisa? It seems the opposite. Challenge to Rav is cited. They say if an animal falls into the pit, whether it falls forward or backwards, the owner of the pit is liable to pay for the damage. So this seems not only a contradiction to Rav, but a contradiction to our Mishnah.
Okay,
I know
one second.
There's
one grammatical correction there. It should be, is this a refutation? The question worded is this a refutation of Rav? That should be an exclamation mark, not a question.
I totally agree with you. I totally agree with you that the way it was put forward should have been in a question format. I agree. No argument there. Gavin, what's your possible suggestion here?
From what I remember, I was a bit dazed when I was reading it, but from my understanding is that, and we have covered this before to some extent as well, if the animal falls forward, it's definitely the foul head. But if it falls backwards, what happens is the animal can actually roll over. So it could have fallen forward but landed on its back. That's one. Or while it was going down on its back, it landed up turning over. So either way, if it turns over and somehow other, even when you fall backwards, you can still pick up the foul air. It's not necessarily guaranteed that you're going to die always from the impact. There's enough foul air to hit you whether you're going forward or backwards.
Excellent point. So this is going to be one of the great Rabbonim that are going to come in defense of Rav, and indeed in defense of the Mishnah itself. So there are three explanations. We're going to get to yours, and Gavin's completely correct. So well learned, Gav. So let's just go through the three rebuttals. In other words, there are three great rabbis that are going to come to Rav's defense, as well as the Mishnah, because when we see a conflict between the Mishnah and the Brisa, we're wanting to find out, is one of them incorrect, or can we reconcile them in some manner? Okay, those are your only two possibilities. Is there some reconciliation? And how can there be reconciliation if a factor hasn't been taken into account? Or alternatively, if they're talking about two different matters entirely. So indeed, they're not a contradiction. Or in fact, the one cancels out the other with logic, but it's very unlikely that a Mishnah will be in and prove to be incorrect at all. Generally, the Brisa might be talking about something else. Okay, so who comes to Rav's defense? Well, three great Rabbanim. The first one is Rav Chisda. And what did he say? He said, look, Rav agrees that with the Brisa, that when you're talking about a pit in the digger's own domain, he's liable whether the animal falls in head first or rear first. Why? Because the animal's owner can tell him, basically, whatever you choose, you're liable, right? If the animal died because of the foul air in the pit, it's your foul air. If it died because of the impact of the fall, it is your impact, since you own, and the emphasis is in own, the ground at the bottom of the pit. So Rav stated that the digger's liability is limited to damage that can be attributed to foul air only in regards to a pit in the public domain. Okay, so in that particular case, we're talking about a pit where the guy basically digs a pit in his own property and he renounces the ownership of the area around the pit so that he still owns the ground of the bore, but the animals can walk right up to it and fall into it. And irrespective, he's liable. So the only thing he renounces is the area around, but not the pit itself. So therefore, they can't have that defense in saying, well, it's public property, therefore he's not liable for the impact. So Rav Chisda gives, for me, a great explanation. So that Brisa, Rav would agree with only with regards to a person's private property, but he agrees with the Mishnah with regards to public property of creating a hazard. Okay, good. Now we're going to go to Gavin's explanation, because Gavin learned from Rabbah. And what did Rabbah say? That the Brisa may even refer to a pit in the public domain. Okay? And maybe what are we dealing with here? Well, an animal that turns over. What does it mean that it turns over? Because it initially fell face first. But before striking the bottom of the pit, it turned over and actually fell to the ground on its back. So in this case, the owner of the pit is liable even though the animal struck the ground backward, because the foul air that affected it as it began to fall when its face was downward affected it when it turned over. Okay, so what are we actually saying is, since the animal breathed some of the foul air in the pit as it began to fall with its face forward, we attribute its eventual death to the foul air. That's according to Rashi's explanation, meaning even if it eventually broke its back and died from impact, had it not died from impact, the foul air would have led to its eventual death. And therefore, even if it ended up on its back, but it started to fall forward, that's a contributing factor. So it's not where the animal ends up, it's how the entire process unfolded. So, but however, if the animal falls entirely on its back and it doesn't breathe in the foul air, the one who dug it is exempt. There's a third rebuttal, and this is Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef is saying, look, we're dealing with the damage done to the pit through the ox, not the damage done to the ox through the pit. So, Kevin, what is the difference there by that statement?
Damage done to the pit through the ox, or the ox to the pit. Is that what you said?
Yes.
And well, then if it's referring to the damage by the ox to the pit, then someone who's trying to attribute liability to the ox that damaged the pit by falling in it.
Excellent. That's exactly right. So
which is like trying to deflect, responsibility. The ox wouldn't have fallen in the first place if there wasn't any negligence.
No. You were on the right track. Okay. So let's stick on your track that you were completely correct. Just give him a chance, Gab. What?
Just the one part I wanted to add.
Okay, you can add. Sure. What did you want to add?
Just the part about the fact that it has to be in the private domain. So, not in the public domain.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. I want to ask you something about that as well.
Okay.
So animals got no, it shouldn't be in your own private domain.
Excellent.
If it's in your own private domain and it makes your water dirty or anything, or it makes it worse, that pit or your system or whatever it is, he's not supposed to be there. So therefore, the owner of the animal is 100% responsible. If it's in the public, then it's what we've been dealing with now. That's a different story.
Arthur wanted to say something. Excellent, Kev. Arthur? Oh, he didn't. He just wanted to show his face. Lovely to see you, mate. So Kev, yeah, what were you going to ask?
Yeah, if you were just going back 2 steps earlier, what you said earlier, that someone digs a pit in his own private domain and he declares the area around it ownerless, so then is that
okay, this is a separate issue. So let me
within his private domain, how can it be public domain? You know,
I'll explain to you. So let me just address Kevin's issues first, because Gavin's summary was exactly on point. So this is how it works. Okay, say for example you're building a swimming pool. Okay, now you're building a swimming pool, and you have diggers around that are digging up the earth. So you've allowed the public, what do we call the public? Construction workers or anybody as part of the construction team. You haven't exactly said that Sipho needs to bring his ID book. Okay, you don't know who's working on your property. You hired a guy and he's picking up casual workers and doing whatever he's doing to fix up the swimming pool. So the area around has now become allowed for public use. When you're not building the swimming pool, nobody's allowed on your property. Again, when everybody goes home, Gavin, this is important. When everybody goes home at the end of the day of construction of the swimming pool, because a pool can take months to build, nobody then is allowed on your property. If you find Sipho or Philemon or somebody still drunk on your property and everybody had left the premises, you're going to call the police. But during the day when everybody's working on your property with construction, it's open to the public, meaning it's in ordinary circumstance. What do we mean? Generally, the circumstances are very straightforward. No one comes to your home. If you've got construction workers, they come to your home. Therefore, you've allowed the public in for doing construction or work. At the time when you don't have construction workers, it's just you and your family. So the minute you've opened up the area around that, the swimming pool for construction workers to come in, etc., it becomes public. Now, say one of the construction workers falls in, or you've got you've got it public, and somebody falls in and injures themselves in that area, but you don't have signage up to say, please note, I'm not responsible for any hazard, caution, enter at your own risk, etc., or deferment of liability. You then liable because it's your swimming pool that created the damage. Okay? It's almost like a case that you have people over for a braai and you don't put a swimming pool around your fence, and God forbid a child comes around to that house and drowns. Now, it's a liability because there should be a pool fence around that pool. Definitely. There's no question. So your level of responsibility is far more in your own premises, because you can't claim that it's public grounds and therefore it mitigates some of your risk or all of your risk, because it's your property. You own it lock, stock and barrel. Gavin brought forward the point that you made, which was spot on the mark, that we've changed the damager and the damaged. What we've learned with Rav Yosef is we always thought that the damager was the pit and the damaged was the ox. Here we're saying that the damager was the ox and the damaged was the pit. How was the pit damaged? Well, you've got your own private property and you're not allowing anybody in there. And an ox wanders in your private property and falls, gets mangled, and damages the water tank. Now that water suddenly becomes septic. It's got mechis, it's got manure, it's got everything, and you can't drink the water. So not only when that next door neighbor comes and says, you owe me for the cow, I'd say, pal, I'll never let you into my property. So I'm not responsible, number one, for the damage of your cow. Your cow trespassed. It wasn't allowed in my property. It walked over the fence. Number two, you owe me, just hang on, Kev, one sec. You owe me because you damaged the waters of my geyser system, and now you're going to have to replace it. Not only am I not liable for you, but you have to be liable for me. What were you going to ask?
So it's a joke. So the owner of the pit would tell the owner of the ox that he was talking a lot of bull.
Exactly. I couldn't have said it better myself. So the brisa basically means that the owner of the ox must pay for the ruined water. So there's no difference whether the ox fell into the pit forward or backwards. In either case, he's liable because the ox fouled the waters of the pit with its dirt, or the water that was held in the pit with its dirt. Okay. Now, the one question that does come up as far as Rav Yosef is concerned is it's difficult to understand why Rav Yosef would bring this up, of changing the protagonist from the aggressor to the defendant. Let me tell you why. Because it's quite clear that it's brought up that it talks about a case where the animal falls forward or backwards. Now, since it trespassed, what difference would it make if it fell forward or backwards? It doesn't seem to make any difference. It's going to foul the waters either way. So there's certain objections to the opinions of Rav Yosef is that the two aren't congruous. It must be something that relates to how an ox fell, because if you've trespassed, it doesn't matter which way the ox fell. If you damaged the person's water cistern and made the waters foul, you're liable and you're exempt if you think you're going to get paid for your animal. So how the animal did acrobatics and landed up dead is irrelevant. So it's difficult to see Rav Yosef's link. Now, I'm not saying Rav Yosef doesn't have a link. He does. It's just obviously the person that brought that objection, or the rabbis, didn't know what his explanation is. And it would be interesting to see how he links that with the forward or backward of the animal falling, because there would have to be some connecting relevance. Otherwise, you could bring in any protagonist. Okay. So listen, guys, this is 36 minutes. I actually don't want to discuss the next part of the Gemara. So you're off the hook. Yes, I'm sure you're all celebrating. So
I want to tell you a joke before we finish.
Just one question in terms, before you tell us a joke, which I want to hear. I wanted to know, are we doing a shiur tomorrow night after Maariv?
Yes.
Okay.
Because we have to make up for Thursday.
We have to make up for Thursday. Arthur, are you feeling well enough to do a shiur at 6:45 tomorrow night?
Arthur.
Arthur?
Should I phone him then? Let me phone him.
No. Tell your joke. We'll find out. I don't know if Arthur.
Well, so it's comment. I went to my friend Sol to meet him one day. My friend from the UK. I rode my bike there before Shabbos, locked it up, had a shower, and only it's 5 k's away. So that's why I wasn't home after Shabbos this side of town. So in this shul, Jesus, like I see people. It's not really a joke. You'll hear. It's a funny comment. I see there's a guy. There was a girl there that looked like Paulie Shaw's sister, the actor Paulie Shaw, the comedian. Yeah. And then there was a guy that looked like Ian Davis' son, Gavin. And then there was another guy that looked like the Undertaker from WWE. So I'm trying not to laugh and look at the oak and concentrate. It's from oak, like big oak, same face. That's mad.
He looked like, the other guy looked like Paulie Shaw's sister because a female version of Paulie
Shaw.
Shaw.
Female looked like Paulie Shaw, like Paulie Shaw's sister. And the other guy looked like the Undertaker. Remember the Undertaker from the WWE wrestling?
Yeah, let me just send Mark and Dustin a message. They know exactly who the Undertaker is.
Okay, listen, I want to ask you a question. Has Arthur fallen asleep? It's not the first time in my
using his phone.
That somebody's fallen asleep.
Look, the guy was breathing. Did you hear the way that guy was breathing? It just doesn't sound great.
He could have passed an emergency. He could be sorting out the guy now or something.
Shame. I hope the guy's all right. I hope he fell asleep in my shiur, rather.
Well, I think it's the foul. I think it's your shiur specifically. It's the foul air. Listen.
Yeah.
That was a good. Give me like a floor or something. I thought it's going to get worse, not going to get better. What I wanted to say is, what mystifies me with this whole thing about the guys talking about the foul air, the guys digging the pit, surely a lot of them died along the way because of the foul air. I mean, it would take hours.
I love that.
We're having the show.
Gavin, I love that.
Ask Rabbi Ron Cohen how the digger made a noise, because that digger shouldn't be alive.
I love that.
It's true that. It's a good point.
Gavin, I have to have that in the share, even if I edit out one or time. It's genius.
I don't think it's genius, but it's just an interesting observation.
Even if he didn't die immediately, he should have. He couldn't have lived long. How could he have lived long enough to make the payment?
Sorry, Damon, Arthur said it's okay for tomorrow night for him.
Okay.
All right.
How could he have lived long enough to make the payment of restitution if the animal couldn't? Because the animal's much heavier than him. It's a brilliant question, Gavin. Your head's on your shoulders, my friend.
Well, it might come up. I mean, you never know. It could come up later on. I doubt it though, because it's not.